All right, guys, welcome to the lecture on inflation. We've finished up the material that we call the foundations, and we're turning towards measurement. We're going to define these ideas of what's going on in the economy and how we go about measuring those things. So we are on to measurement. Okay, so what is inflation? Well, inflation is a measure of changes in the cost of living in an economy. Another way to say that is a general rise in prices throughout the economy. I want to make special note that this is measured prices, because there are many prices out there that are hard or impossible to measure. So when you see an inflation number, there's sort of a difference between inflation measures and inflation as we would theoretically conceptualize of it. Okay, one thing to note here is this idea of transaction costs, right? And you're not going to pick up all transaction costs. We're going to pick up prices. So think of transaction costs as things like search costs or negotiation. These are costs involved in a transaction that aren't the money that's being changed hands, right? So I want to buy something. I have to search around for it. That's opportunity cost because I could have been using that time and energy in different ways. And yet when we measure the price of the good, that is nowhere in the price, right? Negotiation, lots of other types of transaction costs are there. Okay, so why might inflation be a problem? Probably one of my favorite moments when I was an undergraduate taking some upper level econ courses. My professor said, imagine this story. You go in, you get a raise, you know that everybody else in the department got a 2% raise, you get a 3% raise, you're over the moon, right? You go out, you tell yourself, oh, I'm going to reward myself with a soda. You go out to the soda machine and you see that the price of the sodas has risen by 5%. What happened here? And I was completely bamboozled, had no idea, and thought I knew something about economics, and I couldn't make heads or tails of what he was saying. Well, what he's saying is you have average raise, you have your raise, you think, okay, I'm 1 percentage point ahead of everyone else here. You go out and the sodas represent 5% inflation. So your cost of living has gone up faster than your raise. In recent years, with the inflation that we've seen, this is actually very likely a real experience that you or others around you would have experienced where you got some kind of raise, but inflation outpaced it. You're actually 2 percentage points poorer than you were before the inflation and the raise happened. In this case, simultaneously. Of course, that's a stylized example. Okay, so let's talk about some definitions here. A lot of this in the next lecture are going to be definitional. The first definition we want to go through is the price level. This is the absolute value of a price index. Remember, that's the price level that we had before in the previous definition of inflation. Next is what is the rate of inflation. When we say inflation, we often tacitly mean the rate of inflation, and that is the percentage increase in price over a fixed time period. Okay, so the increase in prices over time is the rate of inflation. So when we say inflation, often what we mean is the rate of inflation. We also have an idea called disinflation. Disinflation is a reduction in the rate of inflation. So inflation is still happening, it's still going up, it's still positive, but it's just slower than it was before. In recent years, we've actually seen exactly this play out, where there's been a level of inflation. Then we've had some disinflation. There's still positive inflation. Instead of 8%, we have 6% inflation in a quarter. And administrations have announced, look, we've stopped inflation. Well, you haven't. You've just slowed down inflation, and we call that disinflation. Okay. The analog to inflation is deflation. That's a simple decline in prices. So all these same definitions that we're using here as inflation, if you just said a decrease in those things, that's deflation. Next, we have hyperinflation. This is an extreme rate of inflation. A benchmark for this is usually something like a doubling of prices within a given year, or 100% inflation in a year. Okay, this brings us to a really important idea that we've met a little bit before in this class, and that is real versus nominal value. So nominal value is the face value of something. So if you've got a $5 bill, what's the nominal value? $5. But your real value is your purchasing power. That means it's inflation adjusted. Okay, so 10 years ago, you could have taken $5, you could have bought a meal at a fast food place. Now, if you take $5 and you go, you can no longer afford an entire meal at a fast food place. You're just going to have to get a burger and a drink, so you're going to have to forgo the fries and the other sides maybe. That is an example of how the nominal value stayed the same, because it's $5 in both cases, but your purchasing power has gone down. Rewind 100 years, you got $5, you're feeding the whole family, right? 10 years ago, you're feeding yourself. Now you can't even feed yourself with $5. That's because the real value of that dollar has gone down. Those $5 has gone down. Okay, so how is it that we measure the price, this price level, and we get these factors that we've been talking about? We use these indices. There's 4 different indices that get used. That is the CPI, the PPI, the GDP deflator, which we've already met, and the PCE. Okay, CPI we can roughly think of as retail prices. This is the most common one. If you hear inflation measures in the news, this is the one they'll be talking about. PPI sort of the producer. So if CPI is consumer, PPI is producer. That's, instead of measuring retail prices, it's going to measure like wholesale prices. So maybe trying to take a different look at that. GDP deflator we've already discussed quite a bit in the class, but it's just sort of the most broad, crude, rough measure of inflation, which by the way has its own values. And then finally is probably the one that most economists prefer, which is the PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, which has a lot of sort of very technical benefits from the way that it gets measured, specifically the fact that it can be chained. Okay, so we're going to take the CPI because that's the one that most of you will interact with if you don't go on to be professional economists. It's a very simple thing. We say the cost of the market basket in one period divided by the cost of that same basket in whatever base year. So that same base year idea that we met previously when talking about the GDP deflator, times 100. Okay, so we're saying what's the cost of the market basket in one period compared to the market basket in a different period. Okay, so CPI has some problems, and the most of them are tied into this market basket idea. And the big problem is that the market basket changes over time. Right, so if I want to measure inflation over a 10-year period, there's going to be different products in a market basket 10 years ago than there will now. There will also be quality differences from the things that nominally are in the basket in both time periods. So think about a television, a smartphone, lots of our technological things will be very different 10 years in the past. And so if we measure the price changes between them, the prices might go up or stay the same, but the quality might be so much astronomically higher as to really offset that kind of thing. 10 years ago, there aren't streaming services, so you got that in a market basket now that have very definite prices and refer to very definite things, right? Got Netflix, and I'm paying $10 a month or whatever that is. I guess it's more than that now because the prices have gone up. Then that's, how do I compare that to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago when streaming services didn't exist, or maybe 5 years ago when they did exist, but it's just a very, very different product, right? Okay, the Producer Price Index, the PPI, basic sort of very straightforward idea here. We just sample every industry, so things like mining and manufacturing sectors in particular of the economy and what prices that they pay. This hopefully has a little bit of advantage of their sort of fewer products there, but they're going to be tied to what the eventual end price. Remember when we were talking about GDP measurements, talking about the value of the end product, right? The final goods and services. PPI hopefully is related to that because it's a part of the production process along the way, but there are fewer things to measure might give us a better measurement than CPI might. Okay, so just like a quick example to how we might calculate some CPIs, you can pause the video or write this down, do it separately if you'd like. Suppose that the cost of the market basket this year is $900. The cost of the market basket, 10 years ago was $750. Then the CPI will be 1.2 times 10 gives us 120. So we can then know that that's 20% inflation. If instead of 900 it were 915, we'd get 1.22 or 122 when we multiply by 100. That'd tell us that there's 22% inflation. Okay. CPI has several problems. We call these biases. So what we mean by bias in this case is it systematically and consistently changes the number of inflation off of what the real number would be if we could measure it perfectly towards either higher or lower. Okay, so what are these CPI biases? The first is a substitution bias. So if the prices of things go up, consumers buy less of them. So if we measure the two market baskets across time, so if gas prices are, gas is in both market baskets, but the gas prices of things go up, then if we keep the market basket the same, then it will look like inflation was even higher than it was, because people might be making all kinds of different substitutions. Instead of driving to the movies, I'll stay home and watch something. Instead of driving out to dinner, then I might be more likely to stay at home and eat home-cooked meals, etc. So the amount of gas that I'll use will go down as I substitute away from it because the prices rise. To the extent that that's a problem with inflation, CPI will overestimate inflation because of that. Okay, I've already discussed the quality bias a little bit because this is probably the principal thing, but you can't account for quality if it says TV in the market basket from 10 years ago, and that means a 250-pound, 4-foot deep television with no true black OELD technology, then that's going to register as exactly the same when we do the calculation compared to your brand new 70-inch, 2 inches deep, OLED, high technology, got all the apps and everything on it, TV, right? And so if those two things cost the exact same, then when if the prices are the same and 10 years apart, there's been a huge quality increase, that's actually deflation. So it's not that prices did nothing. And actually, it could be the case that, say, the TV was 20% better, but 10% more costly. That looks like inflation, but it's actually deflation because you got more for your money. Okay, new product. So depending on how often the market basket is updated, you'll actually miss new products, or of course the converse, right? You'll actually have old products that drop out of the market. So nobody these days has a landline telephone hardly anymore. So if that stays in the market basket, then it will misrepresent what it is that people are consuming. Okay, the final one is outlet bias, right? So there's many things that we buy, but we wait until they're a year old or they're out of season or out of style or whatever, and we get these discounts, and that will cause CPI to overestimate. So all of these things cause CPI to overestimate. It's hard to estimate how off these numbers are, but economists say between half and 1 percentage point too high of estimation of inflation. Okay, so I want to talk about something really quickly. This idea, the difference between percentage change and percentage point change, right? So if inflation is 2% and it's estimated by CPI at 3%, then the percentage change is 50%, right? Because from 2 to 3 is 1 percentage point. 1 percentage point over 2 is 50%. So it's 50% off, but it's 1 percentage point off. From 2 to 3 is 1 percentage point. Okay. So an important literacy issue. We actually see that crop up a lot in discussion of these kind of topics. It really matters, for example, when it happens in legislation or court cases where this kind of literacy of the difference between 50% and percentage points and kind of understanding numerical nuances is really important for understanding what it is we're actually eventually talking about. Okay, so let's talk about deflation a little bit. Deflation is very harmful, and the principal reason for that is it postpones postpones purchases, which cause recessions. The other thing deflation does is hurt borrowers. We generally think of that as a quite bad thing, just because of the institutional situation of hurting banks versus hurting people that are borrowing from banks, right? So why does deflation postpone purchases? If you see prices going down, then you will wait until prices go down further. If everybody does that, then that constitutes a reduction in the amount of economic activity that's happening because people aren't buying and selling as much, and then we'll end up in a recession. That's the principal reason that we're worried about deflation. Why does deflation hurt borrowers? Well, if I borrow $100 and then there's deflation over the time period that I have to pay it back, the $100 that I pay back in the future plus whatever interest, so let's say $101 that I pay back, will actually have higher purchasing power in the future than they did when I borrowed it. Now, deflation is harmful, but inflation is also harmful. The principal thing is that it reduces standard of living. When you have inflation, then that reduces the amount that you can purchase with the dollars that you earn or get from other places selling resources or having other sources of income, such as rental house or something like that. But principally we think about that in terms of reducing our wages. If the amount your wages can buy goes down because there is inflation, then you've been harmed, right? So you earn $50,000 this year and prices are very low and you can, purchase all the things that you want. Next year you also make you also make $50,000, but there's been 100% inflation. Everything costs twice as much now. You can literally purchase half as much as you could before, even though you make the exact same nominal dollar amount. A couple other things. I'm going to skip over the Hertz creditors because I want to talk about it in a minute, but the most important thing is probably that it increases uncertainty. It makes us more uncertain by decreasing the amount of information that is available to us. Why is this important? Okay, if we're trying to make decisions, we're trying to make big purchases, we're trying to run businesses, whatever it is that we are going about doing, then when we've got inflation and we say, well, I don't know what prices are going to be in the future, we are uncertain about how the economy is going to play out. I don't know whether to make the purchase now or wait. I don't know whether to start a business. I don't know whether to sell a business. I don't know whether to increase the activity of my business. The list of things that it hurts is basically the entirety of the economy through this mechanism called uncertainty, and that's because it decreased the real information. If there's no inflation and prices move around, that is true information being conveyed to me as a consumer or producer, right? If I say I'm in the market and I'm producing skateboards and I'm selling them and the price of skateboards goes up, then if that's not inflation, then I know the value of skateboards is higher, people are enjoying them more, or the cost of producing them is going down, and so there should be more skateboards in the world. As a businessman, then I go and produce more skateboards, put more skateboards into the world, right? If it's inflation, then I don't know whether it's really skateboards or it's just a general increase in all of the prices, and so I'll become uncertain about what to do. This is the most important thing. So I'd say, the two big ones are reducing standard of living, increasing uncertainty. These are huge, huge topics, and we'll get into a bunch of this when we get into monetary policy after the halfway point of this class. Okay. In the same way that borrowers are hurt by deflation, creditors are hurt by inflation. If I loan you $100, you pay me back $101 a year from now, but there's been 100% inflation. The purchasing power of that $100 that you gave me is actually, it's more like you paid me back with $50. So creditors are hurt when we have inflation. Okay, remember hyperinflation is very high rates of inflation. If inflation is 100% or more, especially if it's sustained over long periods of time, like a year, 2 years, 5 years, you can actually end up with a situation where the inflation happens so quickly that money becomes worthless. We actually have lots of examples of this historically. Zimbabwe, post-World War II Germany, post-Civil War Confederate money. The printing of it happened so fast that there was lots of inflation, and the amount of money that you had to have to buy items went down so dramatically that the money that people were using in these situations actually became useless, and people stopped using that as money, went back to barter trade, or began to use other types of currency that weren't being inflated. So in the Zimbabwe case, you have what's called dollarization, for example. Okay, so of course there's always the natural question when we've got to this point in the lecture: if inflation's so bad, why can't we just have zero inflation? Why not just zero inflation? Well, the answer to that, one, is that we typically think of deflation as actually being even a little bit more harmful than inflation. And so we might want to avoid deflation. So we might rather have a little bit of inflation rather than targeting zero, so that helps us avoid deflation. There are actually economists, I think, that argue against this, but the main orthodoxy in the field is that deflation is worse than inflation is. Next, nominal wages are difficult to cut. This is very important thing to understand. People really don't like it if you cut their wages. This is why firms would rather fire one individual and save money on their payroll that way than they would lower everybody's wages. Okay, so one value that inflation can have is that it raises up the costs as go, and then employers give raises to keep up with inflation to people that they like, and sort of let wages of employees that they would like to cut their wages of, they just let it fall behind because of inflation. So what happens if I just cut everybody's wages? Well, the best employees will end up leaving first, right? And I'll be left with my inferior employees. So instead of cutting wages, as an employer, I might rather choose who I fire and continue to pay the same wages or give small raises over time. Okay. So how does inflation help this? Well, moderate inflation, can't be big inflation. Moderate inflation allows for some adjustment of wages to happen by how you do or don't give out raises to keep up with inflation. Okay, so slight increase in prices over time can allow for employers to sort of adjust wages without people feeling like their wages are end up being cut. Okay, next, inflation enables adjustment of relative prices. I put a star here. This is sort of like technically true, but I don't find it to be especially interesting because it's like saying people don't like seeing the price of other things being cut. We know that's not true. So it probably makes it slightly easier for relative prices to be adjusted. That's really important because that conveys a lot of information about the nature of the value of two things relative to each other, and that might be a little easier in the presence of very moderate inflation. Not sure that's true, but this is a classic textbook example. Okay. The other classic textbook thing is that inflation might facilitate growth. This is stupid, and there's no mechanism for that. We'll see that later on in the class. What it is that causes growth and how those things come about has nothing to do with inflation or any of the possible reasons of inflation, but it's one that you see really often in textbooks, and I have no clue how that made that into those textbooks, and shame on whichever economists started putting that in textbooks back in the day and whatever fanciful mechanism that they had there. So why can't we have zero inflation? I think the best answer is we probably want to avoid deflation. Okay, so the oh, well, I probably should have put this on the previous page. Some people say, well, if you try to reduce inflation to zero, you pull money out of the economy, which slows the growth. That's not true, but you can sort of see the mechanism that's there. So I'll leave that for later when we get to money supply and monetary policy. Okay. That idea of adjustment of relative prices is embedded on an idea that we call menu costs, and this is just the cost of making a price adjustment. So if you think about a gas stations, the menu costs are zero. Menu costs are zero, but if I'm a restaurant, menu costs can be kind of high because I have to print new menus. That's actually where it comes from, right? Is from restaurants, the name menu. Print menus. So that's how we get this idea of menu cost. So if you have inflation and you have to change your prices really often, then that hurts restaurants or things that places where it's hard to change prices. This is probably why you see new fast food restaurants having digital displays where they can increase prices more like gas stations and less like they used to, or they might have to print out entire new displays or print out new menus, etc. Okay, let's take a look at this market basket now, right? So, what is the market basket? This is the goods and services representing the general pattern of consumer expenditures. The Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps this, and they have 7 groups. You can see those here: food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education, and then other. So, here's a little breakdown on how those happen. About 15%, 16% of the market basket is in food and beverage, 40% in housing, including your utilities, 4% in apparel or other services, 17% in transportation. Here's how those break down. A lot of it in vehicles. This is, of the whole. And then 6% to medical care, 6% for recreation, 6% for education. And then, this other would be a lot of things that you could obviously think of. And that's from our consumer expenditure survey. So that's how it is that we see inflation in our market basket situation.